So far, we have discussed number of theorists in our discussion of structuralism, and you would have noticed that most of these theorists do not come from Anglo-American tradition. If we talk about Vladimir Krop, he's Russian. If you think about Todorov, although he spent a lot of time in other places, but of course he is not a native Anglo-American. Then we also see somebody like Roland Barthes, a very important name in structuralist theory, a French thinker. Claude Lévi-Strauss, again a very important name, and again a French anthropologist. That means, where are all those English critics? Where are all those American critics? This is the question that confronts us now. There is a very interesting observation which is shared by, of all persons, Terry Eagleton, who also offers a very strong critique of structuralism. What he says is that often Anglo-American criticism acts like a custom officer when it comes to ideas which come from the continent. That means, if there are some very subversive ideas which come from France, which come from Germany, in general, which come from the continent. Now, Anglo-American criticism acts like custom officers, and it tries to just deny entry to very subversive ideas. And when it allows them entry, it tries to domesticate those ideas. That means their cutting edge is taken away and they appear in a more toothless manner. In other words, ideas are often domesticated, and so are important theories which are domesticated. So if we think about a position like structuralism, and later another very radical position which was deconstruction, and we see their application, their use in Anglo-American criticism, you'll see that often their cutting edge is taken away. And so is the case with Jonathan Culler. Jonathan Culler is an important name because he introduced structuralism to Anglo-American world. That means Anglo-American world did not have any first-hand idea with any first-hand idea of structuralism. And one very important book, and I already mentioned Robert Poole's book, Structuralism in Literature. Structuralist Poetics proved to be a very important book written by Jonathan Culler. And Jonathan Culler tried to assimilate structuralism to Anglo-American tradition. That means, in Anglo-American tradition, there was already new criticism, there was already a concept of practical criticism, there was already a tradition of paying close attention to text, and there was already talk about finding meaning in a text, finding unity in a text, looking for symbols in a text. That means these were the dominant positions in Anglo-American tradition. For new criticism, which was the dominant mode of criticism in England and in America, unity of a text was considered a very important principle. That means, if a poem did not have unity, then it was probably not a poem. When Culler talks about structuralism, and he's very much aware of what others have said about structuralism, he is familiar with all possible positions in structuralism which were taken in the continent, and his work discusses all those positions. And you know that Ferdinand de Saussure's basic distinction between Long and Perrault provided further insights for structuralist theory, for its development, Long and Perrault. And we saw that in structuralist theory, long was considered very important. And when we saw its application to fiction, we saw that in fiction it was long, not parole which was important. That means system was important, system of rules was important, not an individual work as such. It was only later when Roland Barthes came out with his own method where individual work also became important. Color does something different. Instead of using the concept of long and the concept of parole, color uses Noam Chomsky's distinction. And what is that distinction? The distinction between competence and performance. Chomsky talked about these two concepts when he was talking about grammar, when he was talking about innate structure of sentences, or readers or native speakers' innate ability to produce any number of sentences. Competence is very close to long, but competence is a more dynamic concept in the sense that competence one has in a specific language. And performance is the use of that language in individual speech. So if I am talking to you in English, I have a certain competence in the use of sentences, words, structures, and what I am saying is an example of performance. So competence, basically knowledge of all those linguistic rules, and performance is basically the use that we see in utterances or in the speech of individual speakers. Color says that just as people have linguistic competence, and by linguistic competence we mean competence in the use of a particular language. It is not at all necessary that somebody is educated or well read or has gone to the university to have that kind of competence in language. Anyone has that kind of working competence. When you communicate with your domestic helps or with other people on the street, they also have that competence in the use of English, in the use of language. And when they say something, that is an example of performance. So competence is the property of native speakers of a language, and of course also native like speakers of language. So just as we have competence in language or linguistic competence, we also have what is called literary competence, or we can have literary competence. And this literary competence enables us to interpret a text, to understand a text, to comprehend a text, to find some meaning in a text. So when we find meaning in a particular text, in a particular poem, that is an example of our performance. So that means the concept of long and parole, which was used by Saussure and which was taken up by later structuralist theorists, is given a different form by Jonathan Keller when he talks about competence and performance. Now here we have a very interesting example which is given by Raman Selden in his famous book Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory. It is one of the early textbooks of theory, but still it is a good book. Now I would like you to pay attention to three sentences, or rather to this short poem. And You can also offer your comment on this poem. What is this poem about? So you can just unmute yourself at that moment and you can say something. Don't feel shy in expressing your opinion. And the lines are: night is generally my time for walking. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Concerning the exact year, there is no need to be precise. I read it again. Night is generally my time for walking. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Concerning the exact year, there is no need to be precise. A three-line poem, you can say. Now, any comment which comes to your mind immediately, unmute yourself and say it. This is given in the notes also, which I posted today. Night is generally my time for walking. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Concerning the exact year, there is no need to be precise. Anyone? Any one opinion? Maybe we can just get going.
Sir, just an observation, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So the second line, it was the best of time, it was the worst of time, is from A Tale of Two Cities.
Right?
The opening lines of The Tale of Two Cities by Dickens.
Right. You
So
know that in
that's what
poem, yeah, in poems you do have quotations also. Yeah. So that you identify perfectly. That
yes, sir.
yeah. Any other opinion? Since no opinion is coming, so I must speak about the opinions of others when they were presented with these lines. So it was a kind of experiment, but it suggested something. And what usually the participants said was that, okay, second line, most participants identified that it was a quotation or it was the first line of Charles Dickens' novel. And you know that in poems, you do have quotations often. You do have lines which are quoted from some text. So one reader pointed out that the poem is talking about three different attitudes to time. Three different attitudes to time. Say specific, contradictory, and non-specific. So specific, night is generally my time for walking. Specific. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Contradictory attitude to time. Concerning the exact year, there is no need to be precise. Again, this is unspecific, non-specific attitude to time. Then there can be other opinions also that the poem has a very somber tone, very serious tone, and maybe some other readers, if they are given time, even in this group, they'll also offer some interpretations. And later, it was revealed that actually these three lines are taken from Dickens's novels. All three lines. That means it is not only the second line, it is also the other lines. And actually, it is hardly a poem. These are three separate lines. But here, how these three lines were written, and also because there was something in readers' mind, and so readers were maybe caught on the wrong foot. They started interpreting these lines as an example of a poem, and they also started interpreting these lines. So that means readers were caught on the wrong foot. Really? Color actually has something different to say. It was not color's experiment, but color has something very interesting to say. Or he would have said something very interesting to these interpretations. What is important here is not the text, but the fact that it was considered intelligible. That means intelligibility becomes a very important element in the act of interpretation. And this intelligibility is possible because readers have had a long experience of reading poems. They have had a long experience of looking at those texts which are considered literary, whether poetic or fictional. And so, on the basis of their experience, they started interpreting this text. So, that means it is not really very important what they said. The fact is that they were using certain concepts which they have inherited. They have also mastered certain conventions of reading, right? So color focuses attention on some conventions of reading which are an important part of literary competence. Literary competence. And literary competence actually comes from one's exposure to different kinds of poetic texts, with different kinds of fictional texts, and different kinds of literary texts. And it means that whenever readers are presented with an opportunity to read a text, they will use their competence, literary competence, to find meaning in that text. There are some important conventions which we also as readers have acquired. And what are those conventions? One important convention here was to see unity in this text. Unity in this text. That means in any act of reading, in any act of interpretation, unity becomes a very important organizing principle. So even if there is no unity, readers will try to find unity. And different readers will think about this concept of unity in different ways. Maybe somebody can talk about time, and somebody can find unity in the attitude of the narrator. Somebody can find unity in the use of language. But nevertheless, readers are trying to find unity. So that means this is one very important convention, which is an important aspect of competence. We can talk about other conventions also. When we are reading a poem, we know that it is not talking about something very, very real, in the sense that poetic use of language is different from practical use of language when you want to convey some information and when you want to receive some information. So, for example, if there is a particular kind of fact which is mentioned in a poem, a geographical fact, it may be true, but still we do not go to poems to have knowledge of geography and history. That means this is also an important convention. Non-pragmatic use of language, and readers try to search that. And there can be other conventions also. Looking at symbols in a poem, or finding some kind of connotations in words. So that is also a convention. Now, color's point is that important thing in a text is its intelligibility, and that intelligibility comes from the competence of readers. So what color has done? He shifts the focus from text to readers. Readers' linguistic competence, which leads them to read poems, and then they develop literary competence. I hope you understand this part. Literary competence. So color, if we have to just summarize Color's view, you see that Color in his book Structuralist Poetics introduced structuralist criticism to Anglo-American world. But he also tried to relate structuralist theory to certain dominant traditions in Anglo-American criticism. And which were those dominant traditions? One important tradition was the tradition of new criticism, where unity of a work was important. And that means readers have literary competence, which they have acquired because they have gone to universities, because they have gone to colleges, because they have read quite a bit of a certain genre. And Color also talks about certain conventions informing certain genres of literature. So there are conventions of reading fiction, and there are also conventions of reading poetry, and also conventions of reading plays. So we leave Color behind and we move to another point here, and that point is the impact of structuralism, right? Because after that we will discuss semiotics. What has been the impact of structuralism? One very important impact of structuralism has been that it tries to demystify literature. And when I say it tries to demystify literature, it means it does not consider literature as a kind of activity which has a mystique value, which is inspired by the intuition of a writer or all those ideas which come from above. Rather, structuralism is talking about the constructedness of meaning. That means, if we think about that famous couplet of Ghalib, आते हैं गैब से ये मज़ामी ख्याल में गालिब शरीर खामा नवाए सरोश है. That means structuralism is not thinking about inspiration that way, something which comes from God. Rather, it talks about the constructedness of text, something which is made, something which is created. And when it talks about the constructed nature of text, it means it does not accept any interpretation of that text in light of, say, metaphysical views or those views which focus too much on inspiration or on a writer getting some of those inspired movements. No, it is the constructedness of meaning which is important in structuralism. Furthermore, we see that because structuralism is also talking about culling or discovering those structures, and those structures are the structures of human mind, how human mind does the job of classification, does the job of codification, does the job of organizing ideas. But those structures can be culled, those structures can be taken out, not only from big important texts like Anna Karenina or War and Peace or 100 Years of Solitude. No, these structures can also be taken out, they can also be culled from literature which is not called literature, or from works which are not considered great works, narratives which are not considered very powerful narratives, or narratives known for their literary quality. So that means here it is doing something else also. In the hands of structuralists, literature as a special kind of discourse loses that status. And so structuralists can study any narrative. The example that Terry Gilton gave of that boy who goes to a forest area, who falls into the pit, that's funny story. But it proves that point that those structures can be culled from big text and also from texts which are not known for their literary quality. Furthermore, we see that structuralism has a particular relationship with history. And what is that particular relationship with history? It simply ignores those specific questions which could have taken place or which could have been raised. In other words, structuralism is ahistorical. When we say it is ahistorical, we are saying that structuralism is not concerned with history. Structuralism is not concerned with history. And when it is not concerned with history, it is concerned only with deep structures. But those deep structures go beyond history. They are the structures of human mind. History talks about something specific. Structuralism is not interested in those specific questions. There was also charge against many of those formalist critics and structuralist critics that it is always safe to study form, syntax, syllables, than to talk about the world and its politics. So a lot was happening maybe in the world, but many of the thinkers of the time, they were busy talking about structures, syntax, and other features of text. Then we have another important thing about structuralism, that that is its relationship to human subject. When I say its relationship to human subject, what I'm saying is that structuralism in a way decentered the subject, pushed aside the human subject. And human subject here may mean individual, an author, the creator, the so-called creator of a text. Because structuralism is interested in the syntax of a text. See narratology. Gerald Genette is talking about all those terms. And similarly, Barth is also talking about those codes. Todorov is also talking about all those patterns. Trop is also talking about those functions. They are not interested in the individual author. They are interested in the system of rules which govern a text. They are interested in all those structures, syntactic structures. That means in our literary tradition, author has always been considered very important. And usually it was considered, if you are reading a poem by Wordsworth, then probably you enter into a communion with Wordsworth. If you are reading a poem by T.S. Eliot, then you enter the world of T.S. Eliot and you are into a communion with T.S. Eliot. Not for structuralism. Not for structuralism. That means in structuralism, that communion is not there. It is simply the nature of those rules which are important, not the individual author. That means author was pushed aside from his preeminent position. And that's why structuralism is not interested in the author, in the intention of the author, in the background of the author, in the context of the author. No, it is interested only in the system of rules. So the entire discipline of structures narratology is built on the model provided by a sentence. right? So that means it was a very radical kind of stance where structuralism displaced the author from his preeminent position. Author was always considered very important in romantic tradition. In other words, what we can say is, and here students of second semester can understand this point better, it puts it puts phenomenological criticism on its head. You see, in phenomenological criticism, especially the criticism advanced by Geneva School of Critics, what was important was consciousness of a writer and that immanent consciousness of the writer, which one can see from his various works. And here, structuralism is not interested in that immanent consciousness. It is not interested at all in consciousness, but rather it is interested in those rules, that system of rules. So in this manner, structuralism was very different. But one very important thing about structuralism was that it introduced in criticism a certain element of rigor. A certain element of rigor. When I say rigor, it means it introduced an element of discipline. So just a personal opinion based on intuition was considered simply a hearsay. And that means all those opinions which are expressed about a work, okay, this is a good work, this is an important work, this is a quality work, because structuralism is not interested in evaluation. All these questions were considered unimportant in structuralism. And so we can say that structuralism introduced a certain kind of rigor. And if you see the work of Gerald Ginet, you see that element of rigor, where something is subjected to, say, very careful scrutiny, right? So we close our discussion of this particular subject here, but since there is another very important subject related to structuralism, which comes from structuralism, which we'll take up in the next session. Any question? You can write your question also. Any observation? Now we have maybe just a minute. Somebody should say something. Yes. Samar Fatma, maybe something? Sidra? To a very important subject. This is known as semiotics. This is also known as semiology. The two terms actually refer to two very influential figures who are responsible for, say, founding this particular discipline. One is Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist, and the other is Charles Peirce, who was an American scholar. Because of the reverence in which Ferdinand de Saussure is held, the word that is used in some quarters, in Europe especially, is semiology. Semiology. And in the United States of America, or those who take their cue from the United States of America, because of the reverence in which Charles Peirce is held, the term that became popular is semiotics. So semiology and semiotics are one and the same. In very simple words, you say that semiotics is a study of signs. S-I-G-N-S. Semiotics is a study of signs. Here, there was one very important remark which was made by Ferdinand de Saussure in his lectures. He visualized a particular science of science. Linguistics would provide a model for that science, but later that science will subsume linguistics. That means linguistics can provide some kind of model to this science, but linguistics will be part of that study of science. That means semiotics will emerge to be a bigger field than linguistics, subsuming linguistics in its fold. Later, you'll see that that simple paragraph was turned into a book by Rene Barthes. Rene Barthes. Barthes wrote a book titled, say, Elements of Semiology. And here is a lesson for all students of PhD especially, and also MA students who are writing their project. What is the lesson? That how you can just look at one particular insight in a work, and you see that that insight can be developed further and further, and it can take the form of a book, or maybe in your case an article. Saussure just pointed out something about semiotics or semiology, what it can be like. He just gave a very vague hint, but Rene Barthes picked up that hint, and the result was a whole book. It's a short book, Elements of Semiology. That means Rene Barthes engaged with Saussure in a very creative manner. It is very important for all students interested in writing that you should engage with your sources in a creative manner, either by way of agreement or by way of disagreement. Barthes took that insight, but he disagreed with Saussure in the sense that he did not consider linguistics a part, but rather linguistics would remain a preeminent discipline, and semiotics will derive its ideas from linguistics. On the other side of the Atlantic, Peirce made a very thorough study of different kinds of science and also the combination of those science. In other words, when this particular study emerged on the scene, it emerged because of structuralism. Because structuralism and semiotics, they share that common ground. Semiotics also borrows structuralist terminology. It also borrows many of those terms which were already in use thanks to Ferdinand de Saussure's ideas. And gradually you see that in language studies, it was realized that language can be stretched further and further to include many other languages which get their form from linguistic language. In other words, it is not only verbal form of language, but also non-verbal features which become important. If you ask any student of linguistics or any student of language, he'll tell you that saying something is one thing, meaning something is quite different. You can say something, but your facial features can possibly reveal something otherwise. You may be talking about something, but your eyes are giving a lie to what you are saying. That means non-verbal communication is also a very important part of communication. So this brings us to a very important point, that essentially we would be looking at one broad discipline called communication. And communication includes verbal forms as well as non-verbal forms. It can include linguistics, and it can also include many other disciplines, many other areas of studies which came up from 1960s onwards, right? So that means communication. And if you think about your average activity in a day, average human activity in a day, human beings are always communicating. They're communicating through different ways. They're communicating using different mediums. They're communicating all the time. Either they are receiving messages or they are delivering messages. They are giving messages or they are receiving messages. And by messages, we do not mean the messages that you get on your mobile phone. To give you a simple idea from real life, yesterday I was watching say a television serial, and it was a scene of a wedding, an upper class wedding, very festive occasion, and the bride appeared on the scene. Beautiful bride, very educated, and the bride appeared in very nice, very elegant black suit, right? Now, if I can see the reaction on your faces, maybe you will be a bit surprised. Okay, did the bride forget her pink dress? Did she forget her red dress? Or did the director of the serial mess it up? I don't think the director of the serial messed it up. No, he did not. And neither did the bride forget her pink and her red dresses. No. That means that white, that black dress suddenly communicated something. Of course, what it communicated, it depends on that entire context also. And then when I looked around that particular scene, I saw that brides, say some other people, also important people, the groom's father, they were also dressed in black. And now possibly we understood that okay, there is something called theme dressing, right? And maybe it was part of that. But one worry remains that black is hardly considered the color of bridal dress, right? Can anybody enlighten me on this? Have you seen any marriage where the color of bride's dress was black? Has anybody seen? Okay, maybe you have not seen, otherwise you would have intervened. The point of this discussion is that that dress also communicated something, right? And that means human beings communicate in different ways. Okay, now let us think about another situation. Somebody enters a party and somebody uses a particular kind of perfume. That perfume also sends a message. Or somebody, say, has certain facial expressions. They also communicate. In other words, human beings communicate not only through their language but also through non-verbal means. And here we learn an insight from structuralism that language is stretched further and further to include many other languages or kinds of languages which behave like linguistic language. So that means there are all kinds of languages going around and they behave much the same way as the linguistic language. This is the area of semiotics. So we can think about some specific subjects which became important after semiotics appeared on the scene. Say animals also communicate. So this discipline is called zoosemiotics. Zoosemiotics. There are some simple terms when you see a dog probably say marking his territory. Why is it that dogs become so fierce in their own locality, and when there are dogs from other localities, they become very fierce? Why? Because they try to say give this lesson. They try to give this message that okay, this is my territory. So, in other words, they try to be territorial. Similarly, if you see some other situations, if you have seen that famous movie Life of Pi, Life of Pi. How many have you seen Life of Pi? Can you raise your hand? Life of Pi. Can you raise your hand? Okay. There is one particular scene where the narrator is there on that boat, and you also have that lion. Now, what a lion does is lion urinates, and that act of urination on the part of lion is say a message that okay, this is my territory. So he's marking his territory. So that means zoo semiotics is a whole area which talks about communication that animals indulge in. There is another area which is called kinesics. Kinesics. In very simple words, you'll say that kinesics refers to body language. It refers to body language, not body, not BAWDY, BODY, body language. It refers to facial expressions. Facial expressions. And you know that semiotics has a very important role, especially in the studies of cinema and television. And there, how kinesics can be something very important. See how you see those face expressions, how you see body language of somebody. Why is it that, say, a character who is often very, very poor in a film, and you see that the character becomes rich, and then you see that after that that character communicates very differently. His posture is more confident, his clothes are more sophisticated, his hairstyle is different, his mannerisms are different. That means all these forms of communications, whether facial expressions, whether the tone of his language, whether his mannerisms, whether his clothes, whether other thing that he uses, say maybe say car that he uses. So that means body language or this particular study called kinesics. This also becomes very important, right? Now that means semiotics has a very vast range. Let us think about another area which also has come from semiotics. And what is that? Proxemics. Proxemics. See the word proximity. Proximity. When we use the word proximity, we are talking about closeness, proximity. So proxemics basically is a study of the organization of space, and space both in the outside world as well as in our interpersonal relationships. These days, you hear quite a lot about social distancing. Social distancing. And actually, this whole idea of social distancing also comes from this discipline called proxemics. So, there are different ways of talking about space. We often use the word personal space. that I want space. Say husband and wife arguing that I want my space. And of course, anyone can say that I love my space. Please don't interfere with what I am doing, what I am saying. That means in interpersonal communications also, there is this concept of space. And here there is an important theorist who talked about this space. You can see that now this space is divided into intimate space, personal space, social space, and public space. So let us just talk a bit about this. When you say that intimate space, so even when people you are communicating with in real life, if they come too close to you, too close to you, too close to you for your comfort, that means they are probably interfering with your intimate space. On the other hand, if you see many of those images of certain products where you see a couple, where you see a young couple, then you see that they share a particular kind of space which you call a kind of intimate space, right? And similarly, say another category is personal space, where possibly friends and others interact, or people at home, or maybe somebody you come close to. On the other hand, social space is marked by that kind of distance. And so social distancing, what is the standard limit today set for social space? Maybe 6 feet or maybe 8 feet. So imagine a situation when there is a person, you want to keep your space, you want to keep your distance, social distance, but that person comes too close to you. So you feel uncomfortable. But another person, maybe you are, say, friend with that person, or somebody who is your family member, or somebody who is your, say, partner. So in that sense, one probably can share that space. So this idea of space, and of course public space, if you see all those public gatherings, speeches, leaders, then there is quite a bit of difference between the leader who is delivering a public speech and all those people who he is talking to. That means space. This entire idea of space, and space can also be, say, vertical, vertical, it can be horizontal. Okay. Similarly, space is also the subject in the outside world. How you organize space, how buildings, for example, are constructed, how buildings are made, how a flat is designed, how certain things are put in a flat or in an apartment or in that space. That is also the area of proxemics. In other words, those things also communicate. Those things also communicate. Buildings also communicate. And you know that if we think about the architecture, history of architecture, we can talk about the signature style of modernism. And we also know that postmodernism made its beginning in architecture. My friend Munira introduced me to Ayn Rand, a very powerful writer. And the most powerful character that Ayn Rand created, especially in the work Fountainhead, is an architect. And the novel is also about the architects. So architecture is the subject of that novel. And the main character is obsessed with making buildings in a certain manner. And what is the quality of those buildings? Their functional value. That means if they do not serve any utilitarian purpose, then probably they have missed something. So in other words, that architect is taking a modernist position where space is important. I spent a few months in New York. There was one lecture on New York architecture, And the lady who came to deliver that lecture, she was say more than 80 years old. And the first thing that she did was, he said, "Oh, come out of the classroom." We didn't understand what she was saying. He said, "This is a lecture on architecture, and this is going to be a long lecture. We are starting at 9 o'clock and we'll finish at 2. And all this while you'll have to walk. You'll have to walk all streets of Manhattan, see all those buildings, and I'll talk about those buildings." And another tip that she gave was that walk fast. If you walk fast, you gain energy. If you walk slow, you lose energy and you'll get tired. And believe me, it was a wonderful lecture where she talked about all possible buildings, some skyscrapers, and I can share say details of one or two. There were two very tall buildings, and New York is a city of skyscrapers. Two very tall buildings, but in between that building, there was a building of hardly say 7, 8 stories thing. Say New York has buildings which probably have 60 floors or more, and here was a building of just few floors. And she said, she asked this question, "Aren't you surprised that here the architect has wasted a lot of space? Say the building could have gone up." And obviously everyone thought this, but she said, "But this building is something which everybody notices. Among all these skyscrapers, nobody can miss this building. And when nobody can miss this building, that means whatever amount of money that this corporation had to spend on publicity, he's getting that publicity free." That means here building communicated something. Building communicated a certain idea. And so we can say that how space is organized also communicates something. And again, to give you an example, uh, I feel terribly, terribly upset when I see many buildings in Aligarh, and especially if I go to the Faculty of Architecture, there I feel terribly upset at the foolishness of, say, our planners. Why? Because there is a huge area there. But all those buildings, they are just single storied buildings. That means somebody did not plan for the future. Because in future, you'll have only, say, this concept of vertical expansion, not horizontal expansion. When there is no land, you cannot possibly have horizontal expansion. Anyway, so that means when we talk about proxemics, the idea of space, how it is used, either in interpersonal relationships or in designing buildings or by interior designers, it also sends signals, it also communicates. So this is also an important subject which in fact has come up from semiotics. So that means semiotics is important, and it also studies aesthetic theory. It also studies rhetoric, for example, all those rhetorical devices which are used in different works. In other words, what semiotics is doing, it is stretching the idea of language. And that is why semiotics also has great application. Great application. The other day, some of you were asking this question about applying a certain concept, and you say that semiotics has great application. And here it has great application in not only literature but also in film studies. See how a film communicates, and you see that film communicates in different ways. Say a character dresses up in a certain manner, he speaks also, he has certain face expressions also, and also something which has gone before he speaks, and after he speaks. So semiotics and film criticism, they also go together, right? To give you a very quick view of the development of this discipline, we can say that first it was Ferdinand de Saussure who talked about his concept of signifier and signified, and so signifier and signified become important concepts in semiotics also. How they will become important, we will discuss that tomorrow. And similarly, Peirce also talked about some concepts, and especially three of his concepts are very important. He also talked about a sign, right? Just as Saussure talked about a sign, and in Saussure, a sign was divided into a signifier and signified. Peirce also talked about certain kinds of signs, and three of these signs became very important. One is an iconic sign, one is an indexical sign, and one is a symbolic sign. So iconic, indexical, and symbolic. This again gives us some terminology. Iconic, what is an iconic sign? Where is the use of iconic signs? What is an indexical sign? What is the use of an indexical sign? And what is a symbolic sign? Important concepts that we are learning. Then we see that Rene Barthes took up the idea from Saussure, and he wrote a whole book, a short book, and he further talked about semiology. And he took that basic distinction between signifier and signified, but then he stretched that further, and he talked about another concept, and that concept was again the concept of sign. But he applied that concept of sign to culture, to non-verbal forms of communication, to the myths surrounding him all the time. So that means that basic idea was taken from language, but it was applied to culture by Rene Barthes. And essentially he was talking about the creation of certain myths, a point which we have already touched briefly, but we'll talk about, say, Barthes further with reference to his work on semiology. And then you see that from Barthes, from, say, Saussure, you also have some very important semiologists who use these concepts with reference to cinema. And here I must give the example of Christian Metz. He talked about film language. He took ideas from structuralism, and that way he is considered a master critic who uses semiotics. And he tried to think about the language of film. That can film have a language? Does film have a particular kind of language? And here a basic distinction was drawn, that you have a distinction between a language system. English is a language system, Chinese is a language system, Japanese is a language system, Hindi is a language system, and also a language, something that is like a language. So English is a language, and English is also a language system. But film follows a language. Kinesics follows a language. Proxemics follows a language. So language here means that language is stretched to include all these forms of communication. Something that I said at the beginning of this talk, that basically